Good evening. I'm David Smith, and this is Week in Review. This week, our topic of discussion will be Islam and various aspects of both the religion and the culture. Good evening. I'm David Smith. I'm here with our co-host, Eric Hoffman, who joins us by telephone, and our co-host and producer, Daniel Moran, who's at the controls here in the studio. I'd like to start by extending our condolences to our producer, Daniel, on the loss of his brother-in-law over this past weekend. He died in a motorcycle accident here in Arkansas and was laid to rest yesterday afternoon at the Fairview Cemetery in Fayetteville. So we extend him and his family our condolences. Well, our story, I want to start with a story that I think is kind of significant. I heard it on Democracy Now! Earlier this morning. The German government apparently has been investigating and has arrested a number of Salafist groups in Germany and is going to be deporting them on the grounds that they're conspiring to turn the Constitutional Republic of Germany into a Islamic Sharia state, which of course is an act of sedition and treason if you're trying to overthrow the established government of the country that you're in. So I thought that was an interesting event to occur today. What do you gentlemen think about that, especially given that there's so many Islamic immigrants in Germany, France, England, and other parts of Europe?
The only thing that surprises me about this is it's taken the Europeans so far to realize this. Islam, as we're going to go into the history later, has always been pretty much an expansionist religion from what I understand from reading about it.
Well, I've got a question for you, and this is one of those. I've been watching a lot of Robert Spencer's videos online on YouTube. I've also been reading some of his materials, and he's come to the conclusion that although there is a religious aspect to Islam, it's much more a political system than it is a religious system.
I would completely agree. As we know, the two big sects of Islam, especially the Sunnis, don't really like the Sufis, the mystical aspects, the Druze. All their mystical aspects have been persecuted here and there. And their philosophers, of course, we're going to get to later, Averroes, Farabi, and Avicenna, were all put down and had their books burned at some point. I would say, yeah, it has a strongly political flavor.
I'd like to remind everyone that we have on a video posted called The Muslim Brotherhood in America. It's put out by the Center for Security. I'd encourage everyone to watch that if you get the opportunity. If you can't watch all of it, it comes in about 9 parts. Watch part 8. It's about 2.5 hours long, that particular section. The other sections are about 30 to 60 minutes long. But that section 8 is sort of a summing up of the entire series. It's a very interesting series. And it kind of encapsulates and explains what the problem is with the Muslim Brotherhood here in America and what their agenda is. And the various organizations that they have spawned in this country to carry out this Salafist agenda, which is to establish Sharia law here in America and make the constitutional law of the land subservient to the Sharia law of Islam.
From what I understand, when Kemal Ataturk dissolved the caliphate, that's when the Muslim government started to bring it back.
Yeah, when Ataturk was the one who cracked down on it
Yeah.
and brought an end to it. Now, Turkey, they're trying to reestablish it now in Turkey.
Oh.
You know, that strong secularization that Ataturk and the modern Turkish government have tried. You know, they decided they would use the power of the state to crack down on any attempts to establish Sharia law as the law of the state. You were free to practice whatever aspects of it you could in your private life, but it would not be the public law of the nation.
Okay. Well, in Islam, how important is the establishment of the caliphate?
Well, for those who are Salafists, and Salafia was the one who, in the 1700s, started the movement to reestablish the caliphate and to reestablish Sharia law as the law by which Muslims should live. And so the reestablishment of the caliphate is what Muhammad and his immediate successors had in mind, was this conquest of the entire world and the subjection of all people, either by conversion or enslavement to Islam.
You know, conversion, willing or unwilling.
Yes. If you were unwilling, you had to submit, pay the jizya, the tax, and submit to second-class citizenship, or be killed. That was the two choices that you had.
Okay, well, I think maybe we should delve a little more back into the life of Muhammad. And, of course, the obvious question, when you and I went to school, we were taught that Islam was the most historically verified of all the three great religions. They didn't have a Moses or a Zoroaster that was lost in the myth and fog of history. So, did Muhammad exist?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think now there's some doubt as to whether he did exist. There doesn't seem to be much evidence for his existence during the years in which he was supposed to have lived and the immediate time following his supposed death when his immediate first successors were alive. And that calls into question all sorts of assumptions that are held by Muslims about the Quran, its authorship, its formulation, its compilation, etc. There's very strong evidence that it is not what modern Muslims believe it to be.
I have heard a little bit, I've read a little bit of Spencer, that Muhammad was originally a title.
Yes. Yeah, it means the praised one in Arabic.
Yeah.
Which I think you were the one who pointed out to me, Eric, the interesting fact that the coins.
Yeah.
That were. Why don't you tell us about that? That's sort of an interesting anomaly.
Yeah. The first images, or the first real historical evidence we have of Muhammad are coins from the, I believe it's the Umayyads. And they show a picture of Muhammad on the back holding a cross. So either Muhammad was a Christian, or, as some people think, Muhammad was really just a title for Jesus.
That would be that's an interesting theory. I think it's time now that this historical critical method be applied to Islam the way it's been applied to Judaism and to Christianity. Yeah. And because it's going, excuse me, it's yielding some interesting results in that I think I mentioned this on an earlier broadcast that the world-renowned author Malachi Martin had always held that Islam is simply a Christian heresy.
Well, I had come to that conclusion too after reading a lot about late antiquity and the birth of Islam. Because as we know, the Eastern Empire, there was what we call the Byzantines, or more accurately, the Eastern Empire was Christian, Orthodox Christian, and their main rival was the Persians, who were Zoroastrians or Mazdas. And so if you pretty much became a heretic from Christianity, you couldn't go to Persia. You really wouldn't go to the West, because then you were even a worse heretic. So you would end up somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula.
Now it seems
Yeah,
from when we look at the founding stories of Islam about Muhammad, the corollary between those stories and the stories of Jesus in the New Testament are quite eye-opening. You know, you look at supposedly Muhammad went into a cave. You know, he was on some sort of retreat. Well, where was Jesus after the baptism? In the wilderness, visited by angels. You know,
yeah.
And Muhammad is contacted by the angel Gabriel, and of course Jesus, his birth is announced by the angel Gabriel. So it appears that a lot of these founding stories are simply either deliberate reworkings of Christian stories in the New Testament, or they're distortions, because you know, there probably was not a highly literate population in the Arabian Peninsula at the time, and they passed stories from one person to another over several generations. And of course, we've all played that game where you sit in a circle and one person starts a statement. By the time it gets to the last person, it bears no resemblance, or very little, to the original statement.
Well, I have 2 points I'd like to make on the early of Muhammad and Gabriel. One, everybody seemed to be familiar with the imagery of Gabriel when he came out of the cave, so they had to be familiar with the Bible in some manner. Mm-hmm. And the second one, I'm going to give a plug to my blog here, is that how his vision started sounds an awful lot like sleep paralysis, and if anybody's interested, I just posted a new essay called The Origin of the Gods on my blog at Process Idealism. But let's get back to the other point that everybody seems...
Before we pass from that, Eric, it was kind of assumed that Muhammad might have been epileptic.
I don't think he was epileptic. What I think is sleep paralysis, which is a well-known... A lot of people suffer from it, but some people, like Lovecraft, obviously had it to an extreme degree, is where you wake up and you can't move. What happens is the part of your brain that controls movement, of course, when you're asleep, shuts down your body, so you're not always running around, you're not acting out your dreams, but it hasn't cut that out yet, so you wake up paralyzed, and a lot of people have the most fantastic visions under this state before their brain finally does allow them to move. And like I said, if you read the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, most of them are just direct, just wrote down his sleep paralysis visions.
Well, that's a possibility. That's an interesting observation.
Because Muhammad mentions the great pressure on his chest, and that's pretty much how everybody's sleep paralysis episode starts.
Well, that's a possibility. It's interesting because no one was there when which is the problem with all of these revealed religions. Essentially, you have one person who goes up without any witnesses to verify that this occurred, and they have this conversation with God, and then they come down and reveal it to everyone else. And there's no way to verify what happened. You simply have to. That's where faith comes in. You simply have to accept the testimony of the individual.
Well, let's look at a few more similarities between Christianity and Islam, and Judaism too. The one I want to bring up, which is probably the heart of Christianity, is the resurrection. How would Islam's concept of the resurrection mesh with Christianity's?
Well, there's an interest. This is another one of those stories that has a connection with Christianity where it apparently was distorted. And it has to do with, it's come down to modern times. We're still dealing with this issue. Jesus ascended to heaven from the Mount of Olives. And Muhammad ascended to heaven, not permanently, but for a night, from the Temple Mount, which is directly across the Kidron Valley from the Mount of Olives. And he did it in, you remember he was riding the horse. I can't remember the name of the horse.
No,
but,
I can't.
It took 3 leaps from Mecca to Jerusalem, reflecting the 3 days that Jesus was supposedly in the tomb. And then, of course, he has his ascension to heaven where he meets God and so on. And and that's just sort of a distortion of the resurrection story, or a deliberate reworking of that story by
the Islamic whoever wrote the Quran. That's another question.
I have to agree with you. I think a lot of these people were Nestorian Christians, Arian Christians, who had been driven out of the Byzantine Empire because they didn't burn people at the stake at that time. They simply drove you out. You were exiled and driven out of the community. And I think a lot of them wound up in that particular area down in Yemen and around Mecca and Medina.
Well, we know there were
Eric?
And I understand that most of you're talking about the Dome of the Rock, most of the anti-Trinitarian messages on there are sort of sound more Jewish than modern Islamic.
Oh yeah, they're very Aryan. They sound like, very Aryan or very Ebionite. The 2 Christian movements strongly opposed to Jesus being the Son of God. He was the first creature.
Yeah.
And of course, Muhammad is called in the Quran and in the Hadiths the excellent example of conduct. So he's not the Son of God, but he's supposed to be imitated and emulated.
A lot like Jesus is supposed to be the exemplar
in the religion. Ebionites, he would have been the most righteous, but certainly not God.
Well, maybe you should tell us a little bit about the Ebionites and other Jewish Christian communities that were sort of chased out of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Well, the Ebionites were just basically Jewish Christians, what would be called early Jewish Christians, or Messianic Jews. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, that he fulfilled all those prophecies, but definitely that he was not God. The Messiah had sort of an exalted position and was given the symbolic title of Son of God, but as King David was. You'll hear that repeatedly in the Psalms.
In Islam, do we find also a strong apocalyptic tradition?
Oh, yes. There's another very similar, and that's another correlation to Christianity at the time. That Islam began, a lot of the people who believed in a apocalypse being eminent and central
Yes.
to their theology were driven out also because of the influence of St. Augustine, who decided that the church would fulfill that role, that the 1,000 years of Christ's reign had begun, and the church would establish the kingdom of God on earth. And then at the end of that time, Christ would return and take up his role as king. So there was those who had strong, what we now recognize as dispensationalism, strong apocalyptic theology, were driven out as well and would have probably migrated over to Arabia. So that
And a lot of these,
a significant
Yeah, a
part
lot
of
of
Islam as well.
a lot of these apocalyptic movements, I understand, also had strong political undercurrents.
Yes, yes. As they
That's
do
why
now. You know,
yes, they do now.
I don't know if a lot of people realize that we were caught in the Cold War for such a long period of time because so many apocalyptic dispensational Christians were in positions of authority and power in the military and in the Department of State and so on. And they just couldn't believe that the Soviet Union was collapsing or was not really a paper tiger. They believed it had to be strong and it had to be in a position of power and influence because it had to fulfill the role that Hal Lindsey had assigned it in his book, The Late Great Planet Earth.
Well, it gives them an enemy to focus on
Yes.
that's
But
equal
they-
to or greater than themselves.
You know, they actually believed that, though. And it wound up costing us trillions of dollars. And
And communism, of course, is just an apocalyptic movement itself.
yeah, it's we're fighting two apocalyptic ideologies are competing with one another. So it's very influential. And now, of course, we're competing with people like Ahmadinejad, who believes that he has to begin this apocalyptic war that will encompass the globe in order to bring forth the return of the Imam Mahdi, who apparently went down a well, the 12th Imam, who went down a well in Karbala, Iraq, and is due to come back any time now.
And this 12th Imam, is he going to be like a political, spiritual ruler of the earth when he comes back?
He's going to be the final caliph. He'll be the one who leads Islam to world victory, to conquest of the world. And
so there's also a strong utopian element in
yes,
Islam also.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, let's get back to the early Islam, the Umayyads, who eventually ended up in Spain. And I've read Averroes, and I've read was in Spain. I've read Avicenna, who was a Persian Muslim philosopher, and I've read Al-Farabi, who obviously was an Arab, but lived in Baghdad. And all of them actually felt their Islam was inferior to Christianity. It was more of a sensual religion. Mm-hmm. Do you find that to be true?
Yes. That's right. Yeah, because their apocalypse is, the ultimate goal is this paradise, which is a very physical place. And it's filled with physical, sensual pleasure. It's sort of a glorified, exalted world, but it's still very material.
I understand. Yeah, some aspects it seems like a big harem, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, it remains. In paradise, you have the 72 houris. Each man gets the 72 virgins who remain perpetually virgin, and so they're always young, always beautiful. You don't have to deal with a nagging wife.
Mm-hmm.
Or wives, as the case may be, if you're a practitioner of polygamy, which is perfectly acceptable and allowable under Sharia law.
I also have read a little bit of the Quran, not much, but I know women are basically regarded as property, right?
Yes. And in paradise, in this Islamic paradise, they're still property, but they're not as rebellious toward their husbands. They're not rebellious at all. In fact, they're subservient and obedient to where the man has total peace.
I understand, yeah. Let me relate the one story that impressed me on the Islam. This is the Surah women, if anybody's interested. A bunch of Muhammad's early followers came to him and asked him about the morality of different sexual positions. And he replied to them that your wife is like your fields. You can enter any way you want.
Yes.
And I also understand that it's all right to sort of slap your wife around in Islam. It has
Well, yes, they even
The
have
cor-
they've even had books printed on how to beat your wife when she's disobedient.
so
So
the
there are
American
even
liberal,
texts on how to do this in Islam.
so the American liberal who's talking about the war on women and Christianity's mistreatment of women is really doing himself a total disservice by embracing Islam, huh?
Yes. Yes.
So, who wrote the Koran?
S well, officially, Muhammad dictated it. He spoke it, and his followers wrote it down on bits of leaves and bone and paper and whatever was available. But historically, it's recognized that the culture and society in the Arabian Peninsula at that period of time, in the 630s through the 690s, was basically
Yeah.
an illiterate culture.
Yeah. I understand that some of it reads like a bad translation of Tatian. Is that true?
Yes, yes, portion. It's a compilation of all kind. If you read it, you can find, of course, quite a bit of the Old and New Testament has been plagiarized. But there are obviously very large errors. For example, and this one is one of my favorite, the only woman mentioned in the Quran is Miriam, the mother of Jesus.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
according to
Yeah.
the Quran, now we all know that Jesus lived about 1,000 years after Moses.
Yeah.
You know, quite a distance.
Yeah. Quite a distance.
You know, and but according to the Quran, Miriam, the mother of Jesus, is the same Miriam who is the sister of Moses. So Jesus is Moses' nephew, according to the Quran,
So,
which of course is supposed to be the perfect book without error, given
God got
to
his
given to
chronology a
Muhammad
little.
perfectly as it's preserved in heaven alongside God. There are only three things that are eternal: God, his throne, and his book. And so it was
Yes, I've
perfectly
heard.
given to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. Now, how this happened and without error, I don't know, because it wasn't written down till some 80 years after Muhammad had died, supposedly.
I understand there were a lot of different versions of the Quran before, who was it, the Caliph at the time, decided which one to keep and burned all the rest.
And burned all the rest. And even there, there were certain of Muhammad's early followers who were charged with putting the Quran together, with gathering the bones and the leaves and the parchments and so on. And in the Hadiths, it's related that they indicated that there were certain surahs that they didn't think should be included in the Quran because they didn't believe they were authentic. And others that they acknowledged were missing. They weren't present. And shouldn't, you know, they just weren't present. They remembered them being there, they remembered hearing them from Muhammad, but there was no written record of them. And so they were not included in the Quran.
I also understand that I'm going to ask you, because you're the expert on Christianity, a lot of how they pray was actually taken from early Christian practice.
Yes, yes, a lot of their washing of hands, the 5 time, instead of praying 7 times a day, they pray 5. You know, Christians prayed 7 times a day at the canonical hours, but they pray 5
Yeah.
times a day. You know, they retain the Jewish custom of not eating pork. You know,
And circumcision.
yes, and circumcision, which they do on the 13th, when the child is 13 rather than 8 days old. Because in the Bible it's related that Ishmael, the son of Abraham, was circumcised when he was 13 years old.
Oh. So, and of course, you can take one look at the architecture of Islam and see the resemblance to Eastern Roman Empire architecture.
Yes. And of course, their resistance to images of it, which I find rather interesting. You can make an image of any other prophet or figure in Islam except for Muhammad.
Yeah, which I found curious because they actually have an image of Gabriel.
Yes, you make an image of an angel. Of course, you can't make an image of God because God can't be seen.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can make an image of Gabriel, who's an angel. You can make an image of a jinn. You know, you can make an image of all these other spiritual beings and religious leaders, but you can't make an image. You can't draw the face of Muhammad.
Oh. Well, this is getting more and more curious as we're delving into it.
Yes, because it's almost as if, oh, we can't show Muhammad's, because they claim we don't know what he looked like. Well, of course not, because he may not even have existed. So
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a bit of a problem, huh?
and
So do you think that there were just a bunch of stories about Jesus and maybe a few local prophets that were sort of
I
put
think
together
so.
into this?
I think so. I think
this
they were put together
mishmash
by
of a
people
book?
who were descendants of Nestorians and Ebionites and other Christian heretics, or people who had been determined to be heretics and had been driven out into the Arabian desert. Their families began, they had to make a living, so they became caravan traders and artisans and so on.
I hear that the feeling of revenge went deep in a lot of those heretics that got driven out of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Yes, yes. And that's, I think, a lot of why the warrior-like aspects of Islam, they wanted to reconquer. Because you notice they didn't go into Persia or into India until late.
No, they didn't
They
head
went
east. They headed
into,
west right away.
to the heart of the Christian Empire. They went into Palestine, and they went into the Baltic. They tried to get into the Baltic regions where there was strong Christian presence. Of course, into North Africa. And up through Greece, Spain, Portugal, and into southern France.
We should remind people probably that Alexandria was the see of St. Mark. Most of us don't think about it as a bastion of Christianity, but in the ancient world it was.
Yes, it's one of the 4 chief patriarchates of the ancient Christian world, being Constantinople, Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch.
Yeah. So, and they took Antioch and Alexandria rather quickly.
Yes, relatively soon. And it took them a while to get Constantinople, although they took over most of the southern Byzantine Empire rather quickly.
So you think maybe that the political, when the Arab tribes got it together, they felt they needed a religion to compete with like Zoroastrianism and Christianity to unify the people?
Religion is an organizing principle. 2 things that organize any society: war and religion.
Yeah.
You know, war is necessary for expansion of your empire, so you continue to get resources.
War
And
also brings people
religion
together.
is what keeps the people moral and governable.
Yeah.
You know, you have to have a way of governing this vast empire that you've created, and the way of doing it is through religion. It gives a commonality to everyone.
Because I have read both Avicenna and Averroes, who more or less, when they talk about the Prophet Muhammad, it seemed more as a political figure than a religious figure.
Hmm.
That he had to bring this sensual religion because the Arab people were so barbaric. It's not my words, theirs.
Yeah, you need to. And that's
That-
religion is also a very civilizing principle.
Yeah, I understand also their idea of punishment is way more sensual than in the West too.
Oh yes, yes, they're.
There's vivid descriptions of God ripping people's spinal cords out and stuff.
Yes, it's very, which is common. That was an element of the tribal, tribes. You know, the tribal culture that the Islam rose out of was vengeance. You know, an eye for an eye was what they practiced. You know,
Well, this is
and,
falling together even better because
you know, one of
all the heretics.
the most
all the
horrible
heretic-
punishments in Islam is having your limbs cut on opposite sides of your body. If they cut off your right arm, they cut off your left leg.
Hmm.
You know, and then you can't walk with a cane or a crutch using your right leg because you have no right arm
Charming.
to hold it under. So it's a very
Charming.
cruel type of punishment.
Yeah, charming religion. Yeah.
Stoning is burying someone up to their neck and then stoning them to death,
which is still
I hear-
practiced.
which is still practiced.
Yeah. And beheading. Yeah.
Beheading. Beheading is an interesting form of punishment. You find it in the Old Testament. You find it in many cultures, especially in pagan cultures and so on, but even in Christian culture. And it's a form of denying you redemption, because it was often believed that if you were beheaded, you were not capable of being redeemed. Generally, you were beheaded and castrated. And it kind of fulfills the Old Testament requirement that the priest reject for sacrifice any animal whose testicles had been crushed, bruised, mangled. It was seen as unfit as a sacrificial victim. So that and beheading, you were unworthy of salvation. So those are often punishments that were inflicted.
This idea of vengeance in Islam is very interesting because this would also connect up with the heretics that got thrown out of the Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, their main object of target of vengeance would be the Eastern Roman Empire.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Well, you know, the interesting thing about the capital punishment being for almost every crime, there are very few that aren't subject, was you if you're a marauding group of people moving around the desert, you don't construct jails. So you have to deal with your criminal elements somehow. And you can't put them away where there's society is safe from them. So generally capital punishment is more common in nomadic cultures. And certainly Islam in its formative period was a very nomadic culture.
Huh. So, do you want to go on and talk about the clergy of Islam a little bit, or
I'm sorry?
the clergy? Are they closer to the Christian clergy or the Jewish clergy, the Islamic clerics?
Well, that's kind of an interesting. Islam took more after the Jewish than the Christian form when it came to clergy. Imams are essentially laymen, as are rabbis. They're simply laymen who are lawyers. they're judges of Jewish law. They conduct the jurisprudence based on the Talmud, and the
So they're very close to rabbis, teachers,
yes, very
judges,
close
lawyers.
to rabbis, almost identical actually, because what they do is they interpret the Quranic text, and mostly the hadiths, which are equivalent to the Talmud, the Quran, of course, being equal to the Tanakh or Bible in Judaism. And the hadiths are the equivalent of the Talmud. And then, of course, you have all these various schools of jurisprudence in Islam, the way you do in Judaism.
Ah, very interesting.
Yeah, they took that. So there were a lot of Jewish heretics that had probably been driven. So it's this mixture of Christian and Jewish heretics, that formed Islam, I think.
Yeah, that sounds like a very likely scenario.
Yeah, but that's that's why Jews and Muslims have much more in common than they have differences, actually. Their culture is very similar. Their religion is actually very similar.
Yeah. Well, I know the Nestorian clergymen actually became mostly the teachers to Islamic rulers in the early years.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Jewish members of the society in the Islamic society became bankers and advisors to caliphs and kings and so on. Although, according to the Quran, they're not supposed to hold authority over Muslims, but you have to use the best people you have in your empire to do the job.
Yeah.
And
I hear they had some humiliations built in if you weren't a Muslim.
yes, there were.
Well, this is very interesting. Are we going to go on today, or?
Well, I think we probably have done enough for today. I'd
So
like to talk about the philosophy next week, our next show, because this is where Islam could have had its Reformation, and we wouldn't have had the Salafist movement that has hardened Islam into
what we're having today.
What it is today. And it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to have a Reformation in Islam as was experienced in Christianity, that allowed Christianity to make accommodation with science, scientific development, and the modern world.
Well, yeah, Christianity had forces that made it evolutionary. Well,
because
Islam
you
seems
simply
to be
cannot be an Orthodox Muslim and be accommodating of the world, as these supposedly so-called moderate Muslims want to be. I understand what they want to do and they're trying to do, but they are not considered Orthodox or good Muslims. In fact, they're considered to be apostates, and the punishment for apostasy is death.
Yeah.
Which is another interesting element that I'll just mention before we close. The three things that merit the death penalty in Islam are the three things for which you were excommunicated until the moment of death, when you were on your deathbed in Christianity. And that was adultery, murder, and apostasy. In ancient Christianity, you could not be reconciled to the church until the moment of death. If you had committed, which meant you couldn't receive communion, you were outside the full body of the faithful. And that was also carried over into Islam.
Okay, very good.
So, Well, we'll pick this up, and we'll have Eric enlighten us on the philosophy of Averroes, Avicenna, Al-Farabi, the major philosophers at the golden age of Islam. Next,
week after next.
yeah, week after next, we'll be taking next week off, and we'll pick up the week following that. And that'll be an interesting, because we'll understand that this was a really important juncture in Islam. And unfortunately, the wrong choice was made, and it's had some very serious repercussions. So
For 1,000 years, yeah.
for 1,000 years, and we're going to deal with it for a long time to come. So.
And as always, I'd like to thank all of our viewers and subscribers.
Yes. I'd like to remind everyone of Eric's blog, processidealism.blogspot.com.
I have some new material up.
Yeah, look up the material. Eric's always posting new essays, all of which are very enlightening and informative. Please take a look. And we'd also like to remind you of Daniel's blog, danielheath.com. And, of course, our email here, weekinreview.tv. You can reach any one of us, David, Daniel, or Eric, at weekinreview.tv. And our Twitter hashtag is WIRTV. So until 2 weeks from now, we'll sign off. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Smith, and this is Week in Review.